So you played a lot of tier 6 strongholds, did fairly well, and decided to try tier 8. Or you're just trying to feel confident enough to attempt it. Long story short, now you're here watching this video. What's up? Welcome. This is the first of 2 parts discussing tier 8 strongholds from the caller's perspective. This is also the 5th video in my Combat Officer Guide series. If you want to learn about tier 6 calling or how this series works in general, feel free to check out the whole playlist. If you only want the map tactics, that's the video that comes after this one, again, in the full playlist. If you only want certain information, feel free to use the timestamps to skip around in this video. Following the structure of my previous tier 6 video, we're going to talk about tanks to avoid before covering my recommended lineup. First things first, Artie still sucks. Is it better to use it at tier 8 than at tier 6? Yes, technically, but only barely. Typically, teams at tier 8 are better than at tier 6, so even though you are given 10 tanks to mess around with rather than the 7 at tier 6, you really can't afford to waste those slots on tanks that will not be pulling their weight. For example, Artie. Speaking of weight, fat tanks should be avoided. I'm not saying avoid heavies entirely, like at tier 6, because heavies are definitely useful at tier 8. Instead, avoid ridiculously slow heavies like the VK101P and the OHO. They're incredibly slow and often have low DPM. How do they make up for this? Well, with armor. Unfortunately, everyone at tier 8 will be firing gold, and most of your team will be dead by the time your heavy reaches the fight. Tier 8 is still fairly forgiving when it comes to what tanks you take, but it is heavily limited by player skill. What I mean by this is that good players can win with absolute garbage, so if you're watching this and thinking, but my KV5 and Artie spam lineup is unbeatable, then maybe you're just a pro. Or maybe you just like to have fun in the game, which means you're an idiot, because every World of Tanks player knows that fun does not exist. In my case, we're going to go with what I consider to be the absolute most efficient lineup for all maps following my style of calling. Am I wrong? Probably. But good news is, like tier 6, this is a very flexible lineup, and you can select different vehicles as you see fit. Here's what I bring. 1 light tank, 1 tank destroyer, 3 DPM mediums, 2 fast mediums, and 3 heavy tanks with turret armor. The light tank, at least for me, is also one of 2 different tanks, the EBR-75 FL-10 or the LT-432. The reason for this is simple. Both of these tanks are overpowered as hell. Sometimes you can even bring both of them in a single lineup, particularly if you're bringing an extra heavy tank. Many people are probably going to ask why I don't bring the ELC Even 90. Well, the Even 90 is a fantastic passive light tank. However, that's all it's good for. Some maps don't even let the Even 90 shine, like Himmelsdorf, Airfield, and Mines. There are some maps where the Even 90 is absolutely ridiculous on, though, like Karelia, Ghost Town, and Highway. However, if you happen to bring an EBR-75 and get unlucky facing an Even 90 on, say, Karelia, all you have to do to counter said Even 90 is determine the approximate location where the Even 90 is, and then once that is accomplished, you get your team to aim at that location, rush in with the EBR, and everything kills the Even 90. Of course, you only have to do this if the Even 90 is that big of a problem to you, and you're usually sacrificing your EBR for this, so usually it's better to just play around it. However, the EBR and the LT are better choices for another reason. They have guns that make them useful in fights. If you're on Himmelsdorf, the light tank can participate in the hill fight if it's an LT. The EBR can still be a pain with its decent DPM and assassinate the enemy light tank. While the Even 90 is good, it's not flexible enough for all maps and situations at tier 8 like the LT and EBR are, and remember, everything that we bring in this lineup has to be able to pull its own weight no matter what the situation is. As for tank destroyers, you can bring pretty much anything with decent mobility. The Stridsvagen S1, the Scorpion, and SU-130PM are favorites. I'm honestly going to list the Shitpoke as my tank destroyer of choice, as I'm sure that it will continue to find its footing in tier 8 detachments extremely quickly, just from the fact that it's got ridiculous DPM, and I've actually been really preferring using it recently. Now for the DPM mediums. These tanks are for supporting heavies as well as killing anything that the fast mediums engage but cannot kill. They're your main killing force and should be used as such. My absolute favorite medium to bring for this section is the Progetto, as it is able to dish out a massive amount of damage if the fight requires clipping, and can still hold its own trading shot for shot. If you don't have Progettos, almost anything will do, just make sure it can dish out damage fast enough while keeping up with the rest of the team. As for the 2 fast mediums, many of you may be thinking that the Progettos could count for this, and they technically could. However, I prefer to take Barasks, and K-Panzers work just as well. These 2 vehicles are your position takers, assassins, and emergency scouts. You'll use them for map control, killing enemy light tanks if needed, and moving around the map quickly. It's very useful to keep these tanks alive for long periods of time. The faster the tanks are, the more dangerous they will usually be later on in the game. Finally, the 3 turreted heavies. Again, you have a lot of options. I bring the Skoda T56s, Carnarvons with or without the action, we don't judge. I also like IS-3As, Defenders, Object 7032s, etc. You can use pretty much whatever. These tanks have to be mobile enough to get where you want them to be before the game's already over, and should preferably have enough flexibility to handle multiple positions. This usually means turret armor as well as gun depression, without sacrificing too much mobility. So again, Skoda 256s, Carnarvons, very, very good. I do bring one single Object 7032 just to have a side-scraping heavy. Again, very flexible with the lineup. Now we're going to cover the reason why this video took so long to make, which is the general tactics for calling tier 8 skirmishes. This is super fucking complicated. I had no idea how to explain it simply and in a shortish video. I'm gonna give it my best shot, but if you're still a little iffy afterwards, I highly encourage watching the video following this one about each map's tactics, as I'll then be able to ramble to my heart's content. You also might have to watch this section 2 times in a row if you're very new at calling. Until then, let's go shopping. Alright, so by shopping I mean that you can look at map control as a math problem, one where you are trying to purchase parts of the map with your given currency, represented by your vehicles. My suggested lineup is designed to give you the largest budget possible to buy as much of the map as you want. Even with this budget, you cannot purchase the entire map, as the other caller is struggling to buy the same stuff you are. Also, the areas closer to the enemy cap are far more expensive than the areas closer to your base. If you try to buy something towards the enemy base with insufficient funds, you are going to get bought out by the enemy player who gets a discount. Heavy tanks represent your highest purchasing power, as they are able to brawl and win in 1v1s in the location they go to. However, they take the longest to arrive at the point of sale, and because the enemy wants to buy the same land you do, it's possible your bid will arrive too late. So if heavy tanks are the highest budget, why don't we just spam heavy tanks? Well, that's because if we try to commit our highest budget tanks to certain locations, then we're just going to get outmaneuvered by the enemy tank, whose funds are a lot easier to transfer. I don't know. I'm getting lost in the metaphor. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. Here's how my overall lineup should work to counter this math problem. With my lineup, you invest your heavies to a certain point on the map first, then spend the rest of your budget, which you have a lot of flexibility with because they're all mobile, on the rest of the map. You have the option to spend your fast tanks on taking advantageous positions early before the enemy or allied tanks reach it, or keep them in reserve to counter whatever flank your opponent invested more heavily in. You use your DPM mediums to play on whatever flank you are determined to win and allow them to obliterate whatever's there. Your tank destroyer is placed to support whatever side you determine to be the greatest threat. For example, if you see that your opponent is heavily invested in DPM mediums, you can use your tank destroyer to cover your DPM mediums and even send your fast mediums as extra support. Finally, your light tank does its own thing, spotting whatever you need in order to determine where the enemy invested so that you can respond fast enough. Alright, so that's the metaphor that I attempted to concoct to try to make things a little bit easier to understand. Did it make sense? Probably not. Just in case it didn't, I'll try to explain the same point without the monetary comparisons. Pretty much, my lineup is designed to have a variety of possibilities on every map against every lineup. It's not really designed to Zerg rush down a single side or trade shot for shot with enemy heavy tanks. It's designed to determine where the enemy is with the light tank, lock down an important position with your heavy tanks, keep the heavies alive with your tank destroyer, and obliterate any stragglers with your mediums. If your opponent focused more on a lineup with heavies, then you can play aggressively with your light and fast mediums to determine where the heavy is, and then take every single part of the map where they are not, farming the enemy as they go. This is the weakness with bringing a full heavy lineup, as you cannot take map control consistently if the enemy team is able to just outmaneuver you. If you try to spend your entire budget on one side of the map, all they're going to do is leave you alone and go to the other side. On the other hand, if your enemy took mostly fast tanks, then you can keep your team closer together, because again, the enemy team's going to be outmaneuvering you, and you have the guns and health to trade well against most enemies. That's only my playstyle, of course, as a caller. You will undoubtedly develop, or already have if you're already playing in Tier 8, your own playstyle as you call Tier 8s. There are so many different playstyles that I cannot possibly talk about every caller's perspective in a single video, so I can only give you what works for me. Hopefully this will give you a basis to build off of as you figure out what works for you. However, I can give you a few more tips regarding what you should keep in mind regardless of what your playstyle is. First off, do not put your entire team in a single area of the map unless you are planning to push that side extremely hard and fast. Staggering and not splitting your team, as I mentioned in my Tier 6 video, is the most effective way to receive a push. What this means is that you make sure that your tanks are not stacked up on top of one another by maintaining a distance, while still having a line of fire on each other's positions in case one side is pushed. Make sure your heavies are not too isolated from the rest of your team. You need to make your strategies around your heavies, as they are the tanks that will be the most committed to a certain point on the map. If the enemy team has enough stuff to kill your heavies, they will likely die if they are caught. You can't just rotate them out like your other vehicles. Keep your light tank alive. This is exceptionally important at Tier 10 and has started to become far more important at Tier 8. Your light tank is your insurance. If it dies and you no longer know where the enemy team is swapping positions, you'll be totally screwed if the enemy caller knows what they are doing, especially on an open field. Likewise, if you kill the enemy light tank, you're free to continue farming from a distance from wherever you are set up, or often you can move your team to push a single flank without being caught while rotating. Obviously, this becomes more important on more open maps, as I said before, rather than city fights. Do not get caught up on single strategies for each map. Learn to adjust what you normally do. This is the part of Tier 8 combat that gets most Tier 6 callers caught up. You need to recognize what the enemy team has and learn to adjust to counter what you are weak to, and capitalize whatever the enemy lineup is weak to. This is also why it's a good idea to bring the same or similar lineups every time. That way, you don't have to spend time reading your own team list each battle and can instead focus on the map and what the enemy team is bringing. This is especially important for new callers. After you get a lot more experience, then you could start experimenting with a lot more lineups and try to differentiate and let players play what they're good at. But in the beginning, I recommend trying to pick a lineup and then stick with it just so it's easier for you. Map control, if you couldn't already tell from my crazy metaphor, is the most important aspect of Tier 8 strongholds. If you have good control over the map, you are able to move your team around as needed to respond to the enemy team. This will allow you to shut down aggressive plays that most enemy teams will try to execute, or will give you the information you need to figure out what the best aggressive play for you will be. And that's it for this guy. It's taking all of my self-control to not just rant about crazy different things to keep in mind at Tier 8, but if I do that, this video will never end, so I'm going to cut it off with the basics. If you want more information about specified strategies for each map, which again, I highly recommend, check out the video linked in the description that'll be released by now. Best of luck to all of you in Tier 8 skirms, and happy tanking.